At the same time, traditional retailers like Walmart began aggressively expanding their toy sections, using their massive scale to offer lower prices. Toys R Us suddenly found itself caught between two powerful forces, one competing on price, the other on convenience. The company attempted to respond, but its efforts were inconsistent. Its website lagged behind competitors, and instead of fully committing to building its own e-commerce platform, it entered into a partnership with Amazon. On the surface, this seemed like a smart move, but in reality, it meant giving up control of its online future. And when that partnership eventually fell apart, Toys R Us was left behind in a world that had already moved on. But the real damage was still yet to come. But the real turning point, the moment that quietly sealed the fate of Toys R Us, came in 2005. On paper, it looked like a lifeline. A group of powerful investors stepped in to save the company, promising stability, growth, and a new future. These weren't small players. They were some of the biggest names in finance: Bain Capital, KKR, and Vornado Realty Trust. Together, they acquired Toys R Us in a massive $6.6 billion leveraged buyout. But here's the part that most people didn't understand at the time. This wasn't a rescue. It was a transformation, and not the kind the company needed. Because the money used to buy Toys R Us didn't come from the investors themselves. It came from borrowed funds, billions of dollars in debt. And that debt wasn't placed on the investors. It was placed on the company itself. Suddenly, Toys R Us wasn't just a retailer trying to compete in a changing world. It became a company burdened with over $5 billion in debt, forced to pay hundreds of millions of dollars in interest every single year. Imagine trying to run a business where, before you can invest in anything, before you can improve your stores, upgrade your technology, or compete with your rivals, you first have to pay off an enormous financial weight dragging you down. That was the new reality. And this is where everything started to unravel faster. Because while competitors were investing in the future, Toys R Us was paying for the past. While companies like Amazon were building advanced logistics networks and dominating online retail, Toys R Us was stuck maintaining outdated stores that hadn't been modernized in years. While Walmart continued using its scale to crush prices, Toys R Us couldn't afford to compete aggressively because its margins were already under pressure from debt payments. This created a dangerous cycle. Stores became less appealing, which meant fewer customers. Fewer customers meant less revenue. Less revenue made the debt even harder to manage. And because the company was constantly under financial pressure, it couldn't invest in the very things that might have saved it. At the same time, customer expectations were changing rapidly. Shoppers wanted convenience, speed, and competitive pricing, all things that Toys R Us was struggling to deliver. Its stores, once magical and exciting, began to feel outdated. The long aisles that once symbolized endless choice now felt overwhelming and inefficient. Prices were often higher than competitors, and customer service began to decline as cost-cutting measures took effect. And perhaps the most damaging part of all, Toys R Us missed the e-commerce explosion. While online shopping was becoming the dominant force in retail, Toys R Us lagged behind. Even as late as 2009, its online sales made up only a tiny fraction of its total business. By the time it seriously attempted to compete, it was already too late. The market had moved on. Customers had already chosen their preferred platforms. And Toys R Us was no longer one of them. Year after year, the company tried to survive. It refinanced its debt, adjusted its strategies, and hoped for strong holiday seasons to keep it afloat. But the results were inconsistent. Revenue stagnated. Profits declined. And by 2013, the company was no longer reporting consistent profitability. What made the situation even more tragic was that toys were still selling. The demand didn't disappear. Children didn't stop wanting toys. Parents didn't stop buying them. The market was still alive and growing, but Toys R Us was no longer leading it. It was falling behind. By 2017, the situation had reached a breaking point. Toys R Us was no longer just struggling. It was running out of time. The debt that had been building for over a decade was now suffocating company. Payments were due, obligations were piling up, and there was no clear path forward. And then the moment came. In September 2017, Toys R Us filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. On the surface, This might have seemed like a strategic move, a way to restructure, reduce debt, and come back stronger. The company even secured billions in financing to continue operations. But behind the scenes, something critical had already changed. Trust. Suppliers, the very companies that provided Toys R Us with its products, began to lose confidence. They worried about whether they would get paid. As a result, they became more cautious, limiting shipments and tightening terms. This created a ripple effect. With less inventory available, stores couldn't offer the variety customers expected. And without variety, the shopping experience suffered even more. Then came the most important season of all, the holidays. For Toys R Us, Christmas wasn't just a busy period. It was survival. A significant portion of its annual revenue depended on strong holiday sales. And in 2017, the company needed that success more than ever. But it didn't come. Sales were weaker than expected. Customers continued to shop online or choose competitors with better prices and convenience. The one moment that could have turned things around failed, and that's when it became clear. There was no recovery. What followed was not dramatic. There were no explosions, no sudden shocks. Just a slow, inevitable shutdown. One by one, Toys R Us stores began to close. Shelves were emptied. Clearance signs replaced colorful displays. Employees, many of whom had spent years, even decades, with the company, were laid off. In total, around 64,000 workers were affected. Across the United States and beyond, hundreds of locations shut their doors for the last time. The company that once operated around 1,600 stores globally disappeared piece by piece. And the most striking part of this collapse was its silence. No major scandal. No single catastrophic event. Just years of decisions, finally catching up. Analysts would later debate the causes. Some blamed Amazon. Others pointed to Walmart. But many agreed on one thing. The debt from the leveraged buyout played a central role. It drained resources, limited flexibility, and prevented the company from adapting when it needed to most. In the end, Toys R Us didn't collapse because people stopped buying toys. It collapsed because it couldn't evolve in a world that had changed. And now, think back to that image from the beginning. An empty Toys R Us store. If you walk into one of those abandoned locations today, you won't hear laughter. You won't see children running through aisles. Instead, you'll find silence, dust-covered floors, faded signs, shelves that once held thousands of toys, now completely empty. It feels like time stopped, like the memories are still there, but the world has moved on. And that's what makes this story so powerful. Because Toys R Us wasn't just a business. It was a part of childhood. The biggest lesson here is not about toys or even retail. It's about change. Toys R Us didn't fail because it wasn't big enough. It didn't fail because demand disappeared. It failed because it didn't adapt fast enough. Because it took on too much debt. Because it underestimated the future. And because it assumed that past success guaranteed future survival. But in reality, success can be dangerous. It can make you comfortable. It can make you slow. And in a world that's constantly evolving, that's all it takes to fall behind. So now the question is, could Toys R Us have survived if it had made different decisions? If it had invested in e-commerce earlier? If it had avoided that massive debt? If it had adapted faster? Would it still be here today? Or was its collapse inevitable? What makes the fall of Toys R Us even more tragic is that for a long time, the warning signs were visible, but they were ignored. Inside the company, there were people who understood that change was coming. They could see the rise of e-commerce, the shift in customer behavior, and the growing dominance of companies like Amazon. But recognizing a problem and acting on it are two very different things. And in large organizations, especially ones that have been successful for decades, change is often slow, sometimes too slow. Toys R Us had built its entire identity around physical stores. These weren't just retail locations, they were experiences. Walking into one felt like entering a world designed entirely for children. The bright colors, the endless aisles, the excitement of discovering something new, all of it created a sense of wonder that online shopping couldn't replicate. And for a while, that was enough. People still came. Families still visited. Kids still begged their parents to take them there. But slowly, almost invisibly, that experience started to lose its power. Not because it wasn't special, but because something more convenient had arrived. Online shopping didn't need to replace the magic. It just needed to make life easier. And that's exactly what it did. With just a few clicks, parents could browse hundreds of toys, compare prices instantly, read reviews, and have product delivered to their doorstep. No crowds, no long lines, no searching through aisles. Convenience began to win. And this is where Toys R Us found itself trapped. It couldn't fully compete on convenience because it wasn't built for it. And it couldn't fully compete on price because its massive physical stores were expensive to operate. Rent, utilities, staffing, all of these costs added up. Meanwhile, companies like Walmart use their scale to offer lower prices, and Amazon uses technology to offer unmatched convenience. Toys R Us was stuck in the middle. Not the cheapest, not the easiest. And in business, that's one of the most dangerous places to be. What made the situation worse was the emotional attachment people had to the brand. For many customers, Toys R Us wasn't just a store. It was a memory, a place tied to birthdays, holidays, and childhood excitement. And because of that, there was an assumption, both inside and outside the company, that it would always be there. But nostalgia doesn't pay bills, and it doesn't solve structural problems. At the same time, younger generations of parents, people who had grown up with the internet,